Hello, this is Dr. Blase Bonpane presenting Controversy and Action, a program produced by the Office of the Americas and dedicated to in-depth information and commentary on world affairs. Today I'm honored to converse once again with Dr. Noam Chomsky, Professor of Linguistics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I know that there has been a lot of reference recently to conversion, and the word sounds like a religious term, and maybe it really is, but the concern I have today is how we convert from a permanent war economy into peacetime. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, of course, this is an issue that has been discussed and advanced by the peace movement for decades. And it sounds good. I'm obviously for it, just as you are, but we shouldn't mislead ourselves or others. There are rather deep reasons why the United States has a permanent war economy. These reasons go back really to the Depression. In the Great Depression of the 1930s, the system that existed, the state capitalist system that existed, really came close to grinding to a halt. The New Deal measures were quite ineffective. There were still 9 million unemployed by 1939. Nothing much had changed. Then the war came along, and the war taught a lesson, which is later called the lesson of Keynesian economics, so you didn't have to read Keynes to figure it out. The lesson was that if the government organized production and directed massive public subsidies into production, it could rescue the capitalist economy from collapse. Now, that lesson was taught to corporate managers who flooded into Washington to run the wartime economy. And they left that experience with a firm conviction that the government was going to have to continue to maintain a public subsidy to advanced industry in order for it to survive. Now, for a couple of years after the war, in the late 1940s, there was enough pent-up demand, consumption demand, so the problem didn't arise very seriously. But by 1949, the signs of recession were very clear, and there was great concern that we're going to head right back to the Great Depression again, which was a very serious matter, as people of our age will recall. And by 1949 and 1950, it was recognized that there had to be another major government stimulus. Now, the major document of the Cold War, the major document, which everyone agrees in retrospect, is National Security Council Memorandum 68, NSC 68 of 1950, a couple of months before the Korean War, which sort of set the future developments on its way. That was a top-secret document later accepted as government policy, and it called for a war. It said we are virtually at war with the Soviet Union. It was all kind of hysteria about the Soviet plan to conquer the planet and so on. It called for a huge increase in armaments, later turned out to be virtually quadrupling, even though conceding that the United States was already probably spending twice the amount that the Russians were. Our allies alone were duplicating their efforts. But it also made the pertinent point that and this is part of the heart of it, that military expenditures would revitalize the economy. And that was sort of, that's one significant. It also talked about how we would have to have sacrifice and cut back on civil liberties and so on. That was the sort of, the internal document that set the Cold War going and later became translated into a lot of public documents and actions. But a large part of the reasoning was military Keynesianism. This would stimulate the economy, which is beginning to deteriorate. About that time, the Marshall Plan was kind of coming to an end, and it had not achieved its objectives. It had largely failed. In fact, another stimulus was needed in order to recreate the industrial systems in Japan and Europe, which we needed as our trading partners, and as there was a lot of concern about U.S. exports, which couldn't be purchased, manufacturing exports. We needed those markets. And the way that was selected there, too, was militarization. It was militarism, arms, that drove the post-war economies in Europe and Japan as well. And that has been the major means of government stimulation of the economy. Now, it's a mistake to think of this just as armaments. It's also true of high technology in general. So, for example, say take computers, which are right at the core of a modern economy. During the 1950s, computers were not at a level where they could be sold at on the commercial market. Had not reached that level. So the public paid for them. 100% of development, research and development of computers was paid for through the Pentagon. By the 1960s, they had become marketable to an extent, and about 50% of the cost of developing computers was now paid by the public, namely the Pentagon. By the 1980s, when it was necessary to start a new development of so-called fifth-generation computers, and, big new technology, semiconductors, and so on, the expenses shifted back to the public.
Noam, what we hope to do with all this incredible spending is, through some form of popular economics, get across that this material that has been produced in large part has no use value, and that if we're paying, as I understand right now, for 900,000 people overseas, that's 500 in the military and 400,000 in civilian support work, that can't our people understand that this is why a $25,000 house costs $250,000, that so much money has been placed into circulation and so little use value has been produced, that this creates a perpetual inflationary situation. That's what we hope to do with this initiative in California, and to reduce, to urge the reduction of, say, 5% per year. I think it's an educational process. I wonder how you feel about that.
Well, if we want to educate, we have to be honest, and we have to be a little careful about the notion use value.
Yes.
If you mean use for people,
yes,
for you and me and other people, you're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
If you mean use for a corporate manager, it's quite a different matter.
Mm-hmm.
For a corporate manager, the Pentagon system is basically a gift. The Pentagon system pays the costs, meaning the public through the Pentagon, pays the costs of research and development, which are not profitable. Then if anything comes out, it's handed over to the private corporations for profit. The Pentagon system provides a state-guaranteed market for high-technology production. It means the public is going to purchase whatever junk is produced, and that's a cushion for planning. It enables corporate managers to use funds for productive investment when it's possible, but they got this guarantee that the public will bail them out and keep them going.
But can't they see the very dangerous nature of this? You have state funds used ultimately for private profit, and you also have a situation where the profit goes to the hands of a few, but the costs are borne by everyone.
That's what we call free enterprise, is public subsidy and narrowly concentrated private profit. It takes a couple of weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article headlined, "The Unsettling Specter of Peace."
Yes.
They were concerned about the danger of peace. It's an unsettling specter.
Mm-hmm.
It does threaten this method of public subsidy of high technology, which, as you say, for the few. When you read down the article, you find, for example, they quote former Army Chief of Staff Meyer, and he says, well, not a big problem. The new peacetime Army is going to be very high tech. He says, fancy electronics and robot tanks and so on, which won't be used for any military purpose, but that's not the point. And he says that'll be plenty of business for the electronics industry and so on. When Star Wars was marketed, not to the folks at home, when somebody gave a speech about Star Wars to the population, they talked about how we have to protect ourselves from the Russians. But when Abramson went out to the business community, or when they went to Europe and Japan, they talked about the business opportunities that would come out of this. And those are things we have to understand. And the further point to make is that alternatives are not so simple. Now, an economist can sit down and tell you, and he's right, that expenditures for infrastructure and for social needs and so on will have the same stimulative effect, maybe even a better stimulative effect than waste production. But the trouble with that, and in fact business is well aware of that. I mean, business journals back to the late 1940s have been pointing this out. But they're against it nevertheless. And they're against it on very clear and understandable grounds from their point of view. there is going to be a government input to the economy, government economic management. That's inevitable in a state capitalist system. Question is what it will be. If it's through the Pentagon system, it's basically a gift to the corporate manager. It doesn't interfere with corporate prerogatives. Businessmen make their own decisions. The government, that is the public, government just means the public, just buys it or funds them and so on.
Well, I think, however, in spite of all this, there is a realignment going on in thinking. It reminds me of someone who said the revolution in our country took place between 1760 and 1770, when people began to change their viewpoint of what monarchy was or should be and what their future should be. I think that we're hearing a lot of rejection of the concept of the permanent war economy. And, for example, people can simply look at Japan and see the enormous productive capacity of useful items and realize that she has spent only, 1 or 2% of her budget on the military, and they could see that, I believe, as a formula for success. So what I'm driving at is that I think this peace breaking out that is maybe going to terrify the Wall Street people and others and the military industrial people, it is beyond, I think, their control. I don't believe they're going to be able to do anything about it, and I find that quite exciting.
I wish I could agree with you about that, but I don't think it's true. There's a lot that they can do about it, and they are doing things about it. We have to remember that this is a political system which is run basically by the wealthy, by the corporations for their interests. And they have many means that they can use. Now, Japan, you take your analogy to the ending the monarchy. It wasn't enough to think that we don't want a monarchy. You had to fight about it.
Yes.
Fight for it. It doesn't just happen. Japan has a disciplined society. Japan also has a state-organized economic system with massive interstate intervention and coordination. And they simply direct investment and resources directly to the commercial market. Our system does it in a devious way through the Pentagon, and then if there's any spin-off to the commercial market, naturally that's much less efficient, as you say. But there's a reason for that. The reason is that this is a relatively free country, and Japan is a very disciplined country, much less free, in fact. So the Japanese population, if they're told to, here's the way your money is going to be spent, here's what your consumption level is going to be, here's the way you're going to live, and so on, because we have to fund high technology, there are very few questions raised. In the United States, no politician is going to say that. What you have to say here is the Russians are coming, or international terrorists are coming, or Nicaragua's coming, or drug peddlers are coming, and therefore we have to arm ourselves to the teeth, and incidentally it's going to fund advanced industry. That's not so easy to get out of. It does take an understanding on the part of the public, but let me go back to the point that I was in the middle of, which is rather crucial. Why not have public funds go to to things of utility? First of all, if public funds go to producing anything that you and I can use, it's interfering with the rights of business. That's one of the reasons why it's useless material that's funded. That doesn't interfere with the rights of business. Secondly, even investment in, say, infrastructure, like roads and hospitals and so on, while it has a stimulative effect, as business has long recognized, it has the effect, also has other effects. It has the effect of organizing new constituencies. That is, people care about those things. They make decisions about them, and they get involved in them. It redistributes income. It gets people more involved in the political process. And all of those are things that elite groups don't want.
But the problem is, I believe, Noam, that even the mass media, through programs like 60 Minutes, are pointing out that the infrastructure of the United States is in shambles, that our dams are gone and our highways are in disrepair and our cities are a disaster, both from the standpoint of building and air, and all of this is becoming common knowledge. So there seem to be certain elements in the area of power in our country that understand that we must engage in useful production.
Well, in fact, there was just the other day, a front-page story in the New York Times which quoted a number of business executives pointing out what is, in fact, ought to be common knowledge, that we're developing our own third world at home, and that's going to be very harmful to business interests. There won't be people to do the clerical jobs. More than half the new jobs from about the mid-'80s through the year 2000 are going to have to be filled by minorities. And those are the people who are living in deteriorating, decaying inner cities without decent schools and without opportunities, not learning literacy, and let alone computer literacy, which they'll need, and so on. That's a problem. But the trouble is a real conflict there. If public funds go into those areas, they will enhance the interests of the general public, and also the involvement of the general public in public affairs, and they will redistribute income and so on, and they will limit and interfere with the prerogatives of the wealthy. Now, since it's basically the wealthy who set policy, they're in a conflict. On the one hand, they would like to maintain the gift to corporate managers in the Pentagon system. On the other hand, they recognize that they're going to lose out that way. In fact, it's a situation which in some ways is like that of business in South Africa. Some years back, business interests in South Africa began to come to recognize that apartheid is just not a viable system for them. In a modern industrial society, you don't want a population of slaves to go down into the mines. You need skilled workers and managers and people who can follow orders and so on. So there's a conflict. I mean, there's pressure for apartheid because of the privilege it affords, and there's pressure against it because you can't sustain your own even narrow business interests that way. And we're facing a similar situation with our own kind of de facto apartheid. But if matters were simply left in the hands of the elites who have been running policy, I think they'd probably to the Pentagon system, no matter how wasteful it is. If there's going to be a move towards conversion, it's going to have to involve something like a social revolution.
Well, I think that's certainly what is called for, because we see these problems certainly in both the Democratic and Republican side. I can't help but think of the fact that Senator Harkin had a program to cut back half the military aid to El Salvador, and the program was destroyed by Senator Dodd, who came in with a program for aid to the military of El Salvador, which was almost the same as what President Bush wanted. So we have to certainly look for movements outside of the party structure, and that's why I was rather taken with the sophisticated process of the voters to end the arms race, taking it upon themselves to form an initiative for the state of California, where the state would put the federal government, the national government, on notice that they wanted to enter into a process of conversion in the most military-oriented state in the Union. I often wonder how self-conscious they are. I often wonder if there aren't exceptions among them that understand the basic insanity of their position. Do you feel that there is a homogeneity to that, the elements that have the power, or do we see some exceptions among them?
There's a limited range of opinion. It's rather limited, but remember, in a competitive system, in a system where you're trying to make money, or any kind of competitive system for that matter, there's a rather strong pressure to be concerned primarily for short-term advantage. If somebody puts their resources, let's be concrete. Suppose you got two automobile companies, say GM and Ford, and suppose one of them is putting their resources into making the most money next year, and the other one is putting their money into planning the best cars for 10 years from now. Well, the trouble is it's the second one that's doing the reasonable thing from the point of view of the consumers and future generations and so on. But they're not going to be in business in 10 years because they'll be undermined by the short-term profit made by their competitor. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is completely mechanical, but that's a tendency that exists in a capitalist economy, in fact, in any competitive system, that leads people to concentrate on short-term gain, the bottom line for the next quarter. That's the way you get a raise. That's the way you keep your job. That's the way you get profit for tomorrow to invest, and so on. And that leads to very irrational social decisions.
I can understand that, but in certain areas we're being confronted with disaster. For example, in Los Angeles we have a level of air pollution that some scientists from UCLA said was the equivalent of smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. I think we're at the point where we're going to have something like the experience of London in the 50s of people dropping off because of carbon monoxide. People driving to work into a pea soup of atmospheric sewerage every day, regardless of where they're coming from in terms of their political views, must understand that some fundamental changes are necessary. If we could vote to get rid of the smog, I think we would do that. But apparently we aren't able to do things like that. What I'm driving at is there are certain things taking place in our society where there's very little time left to avoid disasters. Do we have to wait for those disasters to see some change in the economic perspective of the military-industrial complex?
Well, if we wait, we're out of luck.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's not going to happen by itself. I mean, to go back to your earlier analogy, any more than the American Revolution took place by itself.
Yes, first it was a process of thinking. I can remember seeing some early sermons from the 17th century stating that obedience to the king is obedience to God. And then I was reviewing some sermons later from the 1760s which were saying obedience to tyrants is disobedience to God. So there is there is somehow a matter of perspective here, I think. And I do believe the viewpoint of people in religiously accepting what the administration says is extremely dangerous, and that they will have to understand that such authority has to be questioned as a matter of routine.
They certainly have to understand that, and they also have to understand what they're up against. I mean, it's not as if in charge are simply making decisions which are irrational from their point of view. Their point of view is basically short-term gain. And from that point of view, there's kind of rationality to what they're doing, even though its general social effects and its long-term effects are disastrous. And that means that we have to have different kinds of social planning. We have to move towards an actual functioning democracy in which the general population doesn't just come around every once in a while and ratify decisions that have been made by others, but actually participates in making them. Now, the initiative that you mentioned at the beginning is very much to the point, but if I can keep to your analogy, an initiative signed by people in the 13 colonies in 1775 saying we want freedom would have been important, but it wouldn't have gotten rid of the British.
Well, that's why we have to look to other instruments of change, I think, and we can see some of those as functional. Certainly we don't want to look for Mickey Mouse instruments, but I do see the value of the mass mobilization, of the boycott, of the strike, of all of these tools that are being developed, hopefully, for a century to come that will be marked by peaceful change, but by powerful change on the part of people that will be willing not to go to work if they're going to have to be confronted with the quality of air that we have and things of that nature. I wanted to ask you about something else, Noam. There is this situation going on in Kampuchea that's a little worrisome. Now, with the presence of the Vietnamese, we had the Pol Pot forces under control. Now the Vietnamese have left, and I know Dan Quayle was recently saying we're going to support the non-communist resistance in Kampuchea. Does he consider the Pol Pot forces to be part of that so-called non-communist resistance? What is going on here?
I guess what Dan Quayle has in his mind or on his paper, but people who pay attention to what's going on and aren't simply reading their lines know very well that the non-communist resistance means the Khmer Rouge. They're the fighting forces. Prince Sihanouk is a kind of a nominal political leader, but the fighting forces are overwhelmingly Khmer Rouge, and that's been true Pol Pot forces, in other words. Now, they have been rebuilt. After they were driven out by the Vietnamese and Vietnam invaded in December 1978, the Khmer Rouge, the Pol Pot forces, were pretty much driven out of the country. They were then rebuilt in Thailand, primarily by China and Thailand, our two major allies, and with U.S. support, not just tacit support. I mean, it was clear that that was happening, and the purpose was stated very clearly by our closest friend, our favorite Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, who pictured graced Time magazine and who everyone loved and so on. He said the purpose is to make Vietnam suffer more and more. Every time we put a gun in the hands of the Khmer Rouge, it kills Vietnamese and makes them suffer. And the overriding thrust of U.S. policy in those years, and still today, is to punish Vietnam. If Cambodians die on the side, that's too bad. So we're now, for years we've been claiming that the reason for the embargo and isolation of Vietnam is because they invaded Cambodia, and that we wouldn't end the embargo and isolation until they withdrew from Cambodia. Well, they've withdrawn from Cambodia, and now that pretense has disappeared, and it turns out that we're going to maintain the embargo and the isolation. We're going to continue bleeding Vietnam, and we're going to, now the new policy is, well, we're going to continue it until there's a comprehensive, verified political settlement. On the other hand, we also, at the same time, say there can't be a verified political settlement because we won't allow international verification. Neither we nor our allies will get involved in it.
It seems to me, once again, on this point, it's a question of the desperate need of our people to know what is happening. I'm really sorry we're out of time, Noam, and I want to thank you very much for being with us today. And you've been listening to Controversy and Action with Dr. Noam Chomsky and Dr. Blase Bonpane. Controversy and Action is produced by the Office of the Americas. For a copy of today's program,
you're going to stay with us right here on KPFA, and we'll have a copy of this program. It's called, it's produced by the Office of the Americas, and you've been listening to Blase Bonpane, the host of the program, and he is a programmer at our sister station in Los Angeles, KPFK. You're listening to listener-sponsored radio, KPFA and KPFB in Berkeley, KFCF in Fresno. It's 28 minutes after 5 o'clock, and this is the very final pledge break in KPFA's November fundraising drive. And we're hoping to raise $1,000 right now, which would bring us up to the $70,000 mark. $70,000, a round number for listener-sponsored KPFA. If you're
Boy, something's got to happen. I mean, everybody now, there's not even debate, accepts that people are coming out of school, being passed on from grade to grade.